Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas lived during an age when the Catholic Church was the overwhelming dominant wielder of political and religious power in most of Europe. The Protestant Reformation, which we'll get to, which establishes the main rival to the Catholic Church, is still 250 years in the future. And church and state were not separated, and in fact, were identical. There were no European nations in the modern sense that we have today as fully sovereign countries that determine their own economic, political, and social agendas. This type of sovereignty was superseded by the power of the Catholic Church. And this is when we bring in Aquinas. His views are more than just philosophically interesting, but they are actual official Catholic doctrine. The Roman Catholic Church is one of the world's most ancient, enduring, and powerful institutions, spans more than 2,000 years, claims 1 billion adherents. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII declared Aquinas' teachings to be official church doctrine. So he is one of the most influential philosophers and theologians ever. Aquinas is part of a teaching known as scholasticism. And scholastic thought is known for its rigorous conceptual analysis and careful drawing of distinctions. This happens in the classroom, in writing, and it takes the form of explicit disputation. You have a topic drawn from a tradition. It's broached in the form of a question. Opponents' responses are given. A counter-proposal is argued. The opponent's arguments are rebutted. And because of its emphasis on rigorous dialectical method, scholasticism was eventually applied to many other fields of study. And clerics or priests, who were usually the only people who could read and write, sort of had a monopoly on universities and learning. Education was necessarily Catholic. And all of this took place almost exclusively in monasteries. Candidates for a bachelor's degree took 6 years to study the 7 liberal arts: geometry, grammar, logic, rhetoric, astronomy, music theory, and arithmetic. And after completing this course, they could continue studying law, medicine, or theology for up to 12 years in the pursuit of a doctorate degree. And theology was, of course, the most difficult and prestigious field. There are a few highlights about Aquinas that I want to touch on. Faith and reason are the two primary tools necessary for processing data in order to obtain true knowledge. This was Aquinas' perspective. He believed that God revealed himself through nature, so that rational thinking and the study of nature is also the study of God. But before we move on to faith and reason, let's stop and talk about essence and existence. Aquinas revolutionized Christian tradition by rejecting Plato in favor of Aristotle. You recall, of course, as we've been studying Plato and the transcendent realm of the forms and the 18 methods for gaining knowledge. Aquinas approaches this with this terminology of essence and existence. So let's just touch on this briefly. The way I think about this relies on an understanding of existential philosophy. So the existentialists believe that first you exist and then you develop your essence. What does that mean? Well, in comparison, Christianity holds that you have a soul that is eternal and unchanging, and then you are born into a body. So in this sense, your essence precedes your existence. Whereas in the existential perspective, your existence precedes your essence. The point that was of relevance to Aquinas is that a human being has these two aspects. We are essence and existence. But God's essence is his existence, and that is where God is distinct from human beings. In a sense, we currently, if you have any sense of essence, don't believe that you as a human being continue to exist once your bodily existence is over. Or do you? It's an interesting question. But Thomas Aquinas was focusing on this distinction. So Aquinas wanted to bring together faith and reason. You recall in our section talking about St. Augustine that his epistemology focused on faith in the Christian revelation as the way one gains knowledge. Aquinas wanted to bring together faith in Christian revelation with Aristotle's take on reasoning, classification, categorization, understanding of the particulars. Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, lives at this really critical juncture when the works of Aristotle reopens the question of this relationship between faith and reason. And we're going to watch a brief 3-minute philosophy video from YouTube. It has some offensive language in it, so if you want to skip ahead, go 3 minutes down and we'll skip over the video. Here we go.
Thomas Aquinas was a Roman Catholic theologian who lived in the 13th century and is to this day considered by the Church to be pretty much an example of the ideal Catholic. Aquinas spent much of his life agonizing over the question of the existence of God, and being a Catholic monk, it's unsurprising which answer he leaned towards. Being a great fan of Aristotle, Aquinas took a lot of Aristotle's philosophies and applied them to his own work. He thought Aristotle was a pretty awesome guy. Aquinas believed that there were two ways to arrive at the truth. Some things could be understood through reason and logic, other things through faith, and that's perfectly possible to prove the existence of God a priori, or through reason alone. He formulated 5 proofs known as the Cinque Viae, I think that's how it's pronounced, and some more convincing others, and some of which are still hotly debated by theologians and atheists alike. The first proof is the first mover argument. We can observe that anything that moves must be set in motion by something else that was moving to begin with, and that thing in turn was set in motion by something else, which was set in motion by something else. Aquinas argued that there must have been a first mover, that which was not itself moved, otherwise nothing would ever have begun moving to begin with. The second proof is the first cause, which states that anything that is created must be created by something else because nothing can create itself. But if nothing ever created itself, then nothing would ever have been created in the first place and the universe would fail to exist. Therefore, there must have been a creator, itself not created, which caused the existence of everything else. Proof 3 is the argument of contingency, which states that things that we observe today are not necessary to exist, but if nothing was necessary, then nothing would exist. Therefore, something must be necessary, and that would be God. Proof 4 argues that for us to judge anything to be either good or bad, we must compare it against something that is better, although for this to be anything but entirely arbitrary, there must exist something that is the best possible thing. Finally, proof 5 is that we can observe that everything in the universe, alive or otherwise, works towards some kind of goal, but for this to be true, there must be some kind of supreme intelligence directing the whole show. Aquinas' philosophical writings are one of the best ever attempts at grounding the Judeo-Christian faith in logical reasoning, and the Catholic Church thought this was pretty great. Aquinas believed that theology was a science, and attempted to formulate arguments supporting the Church's doctrine on the grounds of rational thinking. He was a great supporter of the technique of via negativa, which seeks to understand God by eliminating those attributes that do not apply, essentially describing God by figuring out what God is not. For example, God has no physical form or constituent parts, therefore God must exist in infinite simplicity, and God is not limited by anything, therefore God must be really, really strong. The Catholic Church loved Thomas Aquinas so much that they made him a saint, and in Christian tradition it's often regarded that the only person who knew Christianity better was Jesus. We can assume that Jesus' response to this is something like, "Oh yeah, well I have more hair."
Alright, that is our S. Peter Davis video. You are welcome to go back and watch it again. It goes by very fast, but he covers all of the high points. In the Via Negativa, we talk about the nature of God. They showed you that little image where first the form and then the eyes disappeared. And this gives us the position that God is simple. He's without composition of parts such as body and soul, matter and form. His essence is his existence. God is perfect and lacking nothing. We're going to use our ability to reason here, to reason about the nature of God. And why would he have to not have parts and be perfect and lack nothing? Well, we're coming back to this metaphysical point that we've touched on again and again. We're still using the criteria that it has to be eternal and unchanging. So he must be infinite, he must be immutable, and he must be one. And again, God's essence is the same as his existence. And from this discussion of the nature of God, we come to the argument for the existence of God from Saint Anselm. God is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imagination, or they also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing we can think of, because God in reality would be better. Therefore, God must exist in reality. And this argument influenced St. Thomas Aquinas, who then gives us the 5 arguments for the existence of God. You were introduced to these 5 arguments in that quick 3-minute video, and later in the presentation we will go on to cover all 5 of those. Before we do that, let's talk about St. Thomas Aquinas's seminal work, the Summa Theologica. One of the distinctive features of universities in Aquinas' day in this tradition of scholasticism was the so-called scholastic method. And this embodies the disputatio. The disputatio, or disputation, is this public debate among scholars on a particular topic or question. And remember, it's got a strict procedural format. A teacher poses a previously announced question to an advanced student. The student takes a position. Other teachers and students subsequently counter the advanced student's position with objections. Then the student rebuts to those objections. And then on a day soon afterward, the teacher summarizes the various arguments for and against and renders his own decision in a determination. And this culture of spirited public debate led to the development of refined techniques of argumentation and rhetoric. Aquinas, very well trained in this arena, proved himself to be one of the foremost practitioners. And the structure and topics of his works, the Summa Theologica, are derived directly from this tradition. And what you see is basically transcripts of debates conducted according to this rigid rules of the Disputatio. We're going to read questions 153 and 154 just to get a taste of this work. All right, let's move on to our arguments for the existence of God. There are 5: argument from motion, argument from causation, argument from contingency, argument from degrees, and a teleological argument. So these arguments can be broken into 2 groups. The first 4 go into the first group, and these are known as the cosmological arguments. Argument from motion. Let's do the first 4 one at a time. We currently live in a world in which things are moving. Movement is caused by movers, things that cause motion. Everything that's moving must have been set into motion by something else that was moving. Something must have started the motion in the first place. All right, you see here at the top it says argument from motion P1. We also have a 2. So let's look at the 2. Objects are in motion. Everything in motion was put in motion by something else. There can't be an infinite regress of movers, so there must be a first mover, itself unmoved, and that is God. This introduces us, or reintroduces us, to the idea of infinite regress. In a chain of reasoning, the evidence for each point along the chain relies on the existence of something that came before it. which in turn relies on something even further back, and so on, with no starting point. This is what is known as an infinite regress. We were introduced to this briefly in the three schools of ancient Greece. The third school, skepticism, which endorsed suspending judgment, because to make a judgment you would base it perhaps on some definition, but that definition itself would be based on some judgment that's based on some definition. And as you see, we get caught in an infinite regress. So, to stop this infinite regress, if we're going to talk about, for example, arguments from motion, then there must have been something itself not moved that first put the first moving thing into motion. All right, now our next argument is the argument from causation. The argument for causation reads like this. Some things are caused. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else. Since nothing causes itself, there can't be an infinite regress of causes. So there must have been a first cause, itself uncaused, and that is God. So in the video, what was the argument from causation example? Do you remember? Yeah, it was chickens and eggs. So where did the chicken come from? Well, it came from an egg. Where did the egg come from? Well, it came from a chicken. Well, it can't just be eggs and chickens all the way back. So whatever started that or caused that itself has to have been uncaused, or we would get an infinite regress. So what caused things to exist? Whatever that is God. All right, our third argument is the argument from contingency. There are contingent things. Contingent things can cause other contingent things. But there can't only be contingent things, because that would mean that there's an infinite regress of contingency and a possibility that nothing might have existed. An infinite regress is impossible. So there must be at least one necessary thing, and that is God. All right, so what are we talking about here? Well, we might look at it this way. What resulted in you being here to watch this video? Well, your parents. And how did they get there? Well, their parents. All right, well, how did they get there? Well, their parents. Well, you see, this would catch us in an infinite regress. So at some point, there has to be something that was necessary to set off this chain of contingent things. And that necessary thing, that's God. All right, now our argument from degrees. Properties come in degrees. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect against which everything else is measured. God is the pinnacle of perfection. So you might remember the funny example from the video was bacon is better than koala bears. And the movie that's just slipped out of my mind is better than bacon. In order for us to make these types of judgments, that in degree one is better than the other, for this scale to exist, there must be something at the apex of that scale. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect. And God is that pinnacle of perfection. All right, those were our cosmological arguments. Our fifth argument is what is known as the teleological argument. Teleological works toward an end. And our teleological example is given to us by Paley. And here's the question. You're walking in the woods and you come across a pocket watch. Now, what is more likely? That the materials in this woods or natural setting came together in such a way that accidentally it just happened to manifest a pocket watch, or that there was an intentional design? That something intentionally designed the gears and the dials to represent to us and indicate the passing of time. So the argument is that the world itself is like this pocket watch. It's not a random confluence of matter that just happened to work out, that in fact there is a design, and that intelligent design would need an intelligent designer. Therefore, because all life works toward an end or goal, God exists. And that is our fifth argument. All right, and here is again an overview of our arguments for the existence of God, including here the names in Latin for each of them. You might want to pause here and read through each of those so that you are familiar with each of those, because you are going to be asked about the 5 arguments for the existence of God. All right. So the question we're going to focus on in our section about Aquinas is, what is Aquinas' epistemology? You remember these horses. We used them as an example when we were talking about Aristotle. These are particular horses. And here's Aquinas' position. Particulars in the world exist, and we have a body. And because we have a body, we can experience these particulars. And these experiences can lead us to a deeper, closer understanding of God. So here I've demonstrated with this funky picture of what I'm calling the mind of God. And it's our body that allows us to experience particular horses, for example. And in experiencing particular horses, this allows us to cross this bridge into understanding God's mind, because by viewing particular horses, we get a glimpse into God's plan. So we're asking in assignment 4.1 for you to take a look at the numbered excerpt. And what I've done is I've gone through the quest of Thomas Aquinas and taken every sentence that has the word know, knower, knowing, knowledge, epistemology, or epistemological, and put them in a numbered list for you, so that you can focus simply on answering the question, what is Aquinas' epistemology? And you somehow have to take this idea demonstrated by this very funny picture and the 32 sentences and come up with an answer to that question. Again, the particulars, because we have a body, allow us to experience God's plan. And in that experiencing of God's plan, we can cross this bridge and come closer to the mind of God, or knowing God. However, the bridge will never get us all the way there. It can't. Because if it could, we ourselves would be gods, but we're not. So the bridge brings us closer to God, but never gets us all the way there. All right, now to wrap up, there's one interesting quote from Tarnas. However, he never considered himself a philosopher, and criticized philosophers, whom he saw as pagans, for always, quote, falling short of the true and proper wisdom to be found in Christian revelation. And this is this point that if you try and base knowledge purely on reason, then you're a pagan. Because the true and proper wisdom can only be found in Christian revelation coming together with reason. And that was what Aquinas was trying to accomplish. All right, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day.